Okay, so imagine for a second that the rules of the society you live in just completely transform overnight. One day, the authorities have this massive, unchecked power to search your home and seize your private documents, and the very next day, a brand new set of laws guarantees your absolute right to personal privacy. I mean, it sounds like a huge victory for civil liberties, right? But here is a truly fascinating philosophical time travel dilemma. If the laws of your country change overnight, what exactly happens to the investigations of yesterday? Can you use today's newfound freedoms to essentially erase evidence that was perfectly legal to collect just last week? It's like a giant puzzle about changing the rules of the game after the fact, and it strikes at the very heart of how a justice system operates during times of profound national change.
Welcome, everyone, to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a really monumental piece of legal history, a 1996 South African constitutional court case known as Key versus the Attorney General. And honestly, this isn't just some dry legal theory. It is a gripping story about a collapsed corporate empire, a dramatic raid, and a society that was transitioning into a brand new era of human rights. It asks some absolutely fundamental questions about time, evidence, and fairness that courts all over the world have had to grapple with.
Okay, let's dive into this. First up, the tollgate collapse and raid. Second, enter the new constitution. Third, the retroactivity legal riddle. Fourth, the court's final verdict. And finally, guaranteeing a fair trial.
So, Part 1, the tollgate collapse and raid.
To really wrap our heads around this puzzle, we've got to jump back to the early 90s. The stakes here were just incredibly high. Let's look closely at how this sequence of events played out, because, well, the timing here is absolutely everything. In early 1993, Tollgate Holdings, which was the flagship of this massive group of companies, was finally wound up and liquidated. Just 2 weeks later, the residence and offices of a man named Mr. Key, who was allegedly associated with this group, were raided by authorities. They seized an absolute mountain of documents. A year later, on February 3, 1994, Key was formally indicted on multiple charges related to the whole Tollgate affair. The case against him was built almost entirely on the documents seized in that raid, the witness interviews that followed, and reports drawn up by investigative accountants. And then, a few months later, on April 27, 1994, South Africa enacted a completely new constitution. The corporate collapse, the raid, the seizure of evidence, the indictment, all of it happened right before this massive legal shift actually took place.
Now, the legal framework the authorities used during that raid is super crucial here. At the time they burst into Mr. Key's offices in early 1993, they were operating under Section 6 and 7 of the Investigation of Serious Economic Offenses Act of 1991. Section 6 gave the authorities the power to enter, inspect, and search any premises where they suspected relevant items were hidden, and to seize basically anything they thought had a bearing on their inquiry. Section 7 allowed them to disclose that data to others, like, the investigative accountants. The really crucial point we need to remember is that under the laws that existed on the exact day of the raid, all of this, the search, the seizure, the sharing of documents, was completely and utterly lawful. They played perfectly by the rules of the day.
Which brings us to Part 2, enter the new constitution.
Because the rules were about to change in a huge way. Under that old 1991 Act, the state had these immense, sweeping powers to search and seize without much pushback at all. But then, under Section 13 of the new 1994 Constitution, a powerful new civil liberty was enshrined. Section 13 explicitly guaranteed every single person the right to personal privacy, which specifically included the right not to be subject to searches of their home or property and the right to be free from having their private possessions seized. Suddenly, the very actions that investigators took to build their case against Mr. Key were totally at odds with the highest law of the newly transformed land.
All right, Part 3, the retroactivity legal riddle.
This collision between the past and the present brings us to the core legal mystery of this explainer. Mr. Keyes looked at this new constitution and made a really clever argument. He said the old evidence gathered against him breached his brand new constitutional rights, and therefore it should be completely thrown out of his upcoming trial. To really grasp what Key was asking for here, we have to look at retroactivity. That means applying a newly created law to events, actions, or situations that have already happened in the past. It's kind of like a referee suddenly changing the rules of a game at halftime and then trying to penalize players for things they did in the first half. Key was essentially asking the court to penalize investigators for a move they made before the rule book was ever rewritten.
So that leads us to a really high-stakes question, doesn't it? Does a new constitution automatically, just by operation of law, erase old evidence? If an action was lawful yesterday, does the arrival of a new rights-based constitution today cast this retroactive blanket of illegality over the past? The trial was looming, the evidence was gathered, and the Constitutional Court had to decide if Key's time-traveling defense was actually going to hold up.
Let's get into Part 4, The court's final verdict.
Let's actually slow down for a second and thoughtfully unpack how the Constitutional Court solved this riddle. The final verdict was delivered by Judge Kriegler, who had to navigate some incredibly complex philosophical and legal territory to find the right answer. And the Constitutional Court didn't just guess. They looked at established legal precedents. First, Judge Kriegler looked at a local case, Duplessis v. Desclercq, which firmly established that the new Constitution does not operate retroactively. Then the court looked across the globe to a Canadian case, R v. James and R v. Dezajic. The factual setup in that Canadian case was remarkably similar. A search and seizure was carried out under an old tax law, and then Canada introduced its Charter of Rights and Freedoms right before the trial started. The Canadian courts concluded that you absolutely must apply the law in force at the time the act occurred. The goal of a constitution, they noted, isn't to help people get acquittals for past actions, but to ensure that moving forward, government agents respect the new rights.
This whole logic is captured perfectly in a brilliant principle cited by Judge Kriegler. He said, "The Constitution does not turn conduct which was unlawful before it came into force into lawful conduct, and conversely, it doesn't turn conduct that was completely lawful at the time into unlawful conduct." The court ruled that you cannot retroactively cast a blanket of illegality over evidence that was properly and lawfully unearthed according to the law as it stood at that exact moment in time. None of the events Key complained about could be a breach of his constitutional rights, for the simple reason that those rights just did not exist yet when the raid happened.
Which brings us to our final section, Part 5, Guaranteeing a Fair Trial.
So you might be thinking, was someone in Key's position just left completely out to dry under the old draconian laws without any modern protections? Well, not at all. Judge Kriegler was acutely aware of a fundamental tension that exists in literally any democratic criminal justice system. On one hand, you have a massive public interest in bringing criminals to book. Society needs crimes to be prosecuted. But on the other hand, there is an equally great public interest in ensuring that justice is manifestly done to all, preventing excessive zeal or overreach by state agencies. The court recognized it had to impartially balance the need to prosecute complex economic crimes with the need to protect individuals from unfair treatment, and do so without resorting to technical niceties or ingenious legal loopholes.
How did the court actually resolve this tension? Well, they pointed straight to Section 25(3) of the new Constitution, which guarantees every accused person the right to a fair trial. The court emphasized that this right is incredibly broad. It embraces a concept of substantive fairness. It requires criminal proceedings to operate on notions of basic fairness and justice, which was, honestly, a massive upgrade from the older, much more rigid procedural rules of the past. Even if the evidence wasn't automatically erased by the new privacy laws, the broader umbrella of a fair trial still protected the accused today.
Okay, let's quickly summarize the big, actionable takeaways from this landmark decision. First, evidence lawfully gathered under old laws is not automatically inadmissible just because a new constitution is enacted. Second, constitutional rights do not apply retroactively to old, lawful acts. Third, and this is the real safety net here, it is entirely up to the trial judge at the time of the criminal trial to decide if that evidence should be admitted. And finally, the trial judge will make that decision based on an assessment of fairness on a flexible case-by-case basis. Rather than throwing down a rigid constitutional ban, the Constitutional Court placed their trust in the trial judge to look at the specific facts and ensure that admitting the evidence wouldn't fundamentally compromise the fairness of the trial.
And that brings us to the end of our explainer. I want to leave you with a bit of a provocative thought to chew on. When a society transforms and the rules of the game change overnight, what really is the best way to administer justice? Should we rely on rigid, retroactive bans that might erase years of lawful investigation, or is true justice better served by trusting the human sense of a fair trial, evaluated case by case? It's a very delicate balance between respecting the laws of yesterday and upholding the rights of today. Thank you so much for joining me to explore this fascinating piece of legal history. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I hope this explainer has left you eager to dive even deeper into the mechanics of how our laws actually work.